currently facing a situation that has me completely at a loss. To give you the full picture, let me start from the beginning. 5 years ago, my next-door neighbor, a man we called Peter, informed us that his 14-year-old son had gone missing. The news of his disappearance spread like wildfire, shaking our community. The police were involved immediately, and it wasn't long before the story was all over the news. My wife and I were devastated for Peter and his wife, Rachel. We offered them any support we could, knowing that nothing we said or did could truly alleviate their pain. As time went on, the search efforts dwindled, and no trace of their son was ever found. My wife and I assumed that Peter and Rachel had come to accept the grim reality that their son might never return. The years that followed were hard on them. Peter became more withdrawn and awkward, while Rachel turned quiet and seemed lost in her own thoughts. Whenever they invited us over for a barbecue, we could see the heavy toll the loss had taken on them. Fast forward to just last week. I was outside taking out the garbage when Peter approached me with a peculiar request. He asked if he could borrow a shovel. Without giving it much thought, I handed him my best one, not even thinking to ask why he needed it. He thanked me, mentioning that he had some work to do in his backyard, and promised to return the shovel by the next day. Later that evening, as I passed by one of my upstairs windows, I noticed something strange. Peter was in his backyard, digging a large hole in the ground. He was struggling with the task, which made sense given his age. He was in his late 50s by then. Feeling a bit concerned, I decided to grab my spare shovel and head over to offer him a hand. When I called out his name, he looked up, startled, and rushed over to me with an urgency that was unsettling. He insisted, almost desperately, that he didn't need any help and urged me to leave his yard. He even pointed to the gate as if he were dismissing a dog. His reaction was so bizarre that I left without further argument, completely puzzled by his behavior. Back in my house, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. I went back to the window to keep an eye on him. Peter continued digging for another half hour before he finally stopped and began looking around nervously, scanning the neighboring houses as if to make sure no one was watching. Unfortunately, I wasn't quick enough to hide, and he caught me watching. I quickly turned away, trying to act casual, but I knew that he had seen me. Throughout the rest of the evening, I kept glancing out the window, but Peter had stopped digging. I figured he was waiting until nightfall to continue his work. My suspicion proved correct when, at around 1:30 in the morning, I heard the sound of a shovel hitting the dirt. The night was pitch black, making it impossible to see anything from my window, so I decided to sneak outside quietly. I crept into my backyard and peered over the fence into Peter's yard. The moon provided just enough light for me to make out what was happening. Peter was still digging, and as he did, I noticed a small section of a black garbage bag poking out from the dirt at the bottom of the hole. My heart began to race as I tried to process what I was seeing. I looked back at Peter's house, then back at the hole. I was torn between wanting to uncover the bag to see what was inside and the fear of getting caught. In the end, my fear won out, and I retreated back to my yard. It was a good thing I did because Peter returned outside just moments later. But this time, he wasn't digging. Instead, he walked around to the other side of his house, disappearing into the shadows. The next morning, I rushed to the window to check on the yard. The hole had been completely filled in, as if nothing had ever happened. Strangely, Peter's SUV was now parked on the street instead of in his driveway. My mind was racing the possibilities. What if that bag contained his son's remains? What if he had buried him there years ago and was now trying to move the evidence? The thought seemed too horrific to be true, but I couldn't shake it. I haven't told anyone about what I saw, not even my wife. Peter never returned my shovel, and I'm too afraid to ask for it back. Since that night, he's been avoiding me, and I can't help but feel that something terrible is going on. Yesterday, something even more disturbing happened. By chance, I looked out my window and saw Peter standing at one of his windows, staring directly into mine. When he realized I was looking, he quickly shut his blinds. It was the middle of the day, and the encounter left me deeply unsettled. I don't know what to do, but I'm honestly terrified. I've lived in 3 different houses throughout my life. 2 with my family and my current one where I live alone. We spent the first 15 years in our first home and the next 7 in the second before I finally moved out on my own. This experience took place when I was 15, during the last few months before my family moved out of our first home. Growing up, my family wasn't particularly close with our neighbors. In fact, there were 2 kids who lived next door with their dad, and despite living right beside them for years, my brother and I had only spoken to them a handful of times. Their names were Josh and Tyler, and they were always a bit of a mystery to us. One afternoon, my younger brother and I were playing basketball in our driveway when Josh, one of the boys next door, walked over and started a conversation. I don't remember exactly what we talked about, but I do recall that the first thing he asked was whether it was true that we were moving soon. As the older brother, I did most of the talking. Josh seemed to be around my age, although I never asked him directly. By the end of our conversation, Josh invited me and my brother to join him and his brother Tyler the next day to shoot BB guns by the river in the woods down the road. It was the weekend, and I didn't have anything else going on, so I agreed. My little brother, eager to tag along, asked if he could come too. Josh seemed indifferent and simply said, "Sure," before walking away. The next day, just before dusk, Josh and Tyler rang our doorbell. My brother and I were quick to answer, not wanting our parents to know we were about to go shoot BB guns. As we walked down the sidewalk with Josh and Tyler, I noticed that they were both dressed in camo gear and carrying a duffel bag that presumably held the BB guns. The seriousness with which they approached the whole situation struck me as odd, and my brother and I exchanged a few glances, trying not to laugh. When we reached the woods, there was an eerie silence between us. Neither Josh nor Tyler spoke much, which only added to the strange vibe. When we finally arrived at the spot by the river, Josh dropped the duffel bag onto the ground and unzipped it. Tyler, meanwhile, snapped a branch off a nearby tree and threw it into the river with unnecessary aggression. My brother and I exchanged another look, this time one of unease. Josh then pulled out a couple of guns from the bag and handed them to us. That's when he casually mentioned that they weren't BB guns at all. They were real. Tyler pulled out a loaded gun from the bag and started firing at trees across the river, the loud cracks echoing through the woods. I was shocked and immediately filled with a mix of anger and confusion. Without hesitation, I grabbed the gun from my brother's hands and placed both of them back in the bag. I told Josh and Tyler that we weren't comfortable with what was happening and that we were leaving. Tyler stopped firing, and both boys stared at us with expressions that were somewhere between anger and disappointment. As we walked away, one of them shouted a curse at us. I had always sensed that these two were trouble, but this confirmed it. I told my brother that we should avoid them for the remainder of our time living there. That night, at dinner, we told our parents that the kids next door were weird, but we didn't mention anything about the guns. Later that night, I was woken up by a cold breeze hitting my face. I quickly realized that my bedroom window, which I had closed before going to bed, was now wide open. As I stared out into the night, I felt something hard press against the back of my head and heard a voice whisper, "Shh." Somehow, I managed to stay calm. I realized almost instantly what was happening. The voice behind me was Josh's. He whispered that if I ever told anyone, especially his dad, about the guns or what had happened in the woods, he would come back and kill me and my entire family. My voice trembled as I replied, "Okay." He pushed my head with the gun before slipping out through the window. For months after that, every night, I would catch either Josh or Tyler staring into my or my brother's room from a window in their house. Their behavior became increasingly erratic as our moving date approached. Just a week before we left, a rock was thrown at my window in the middle of the night. When I opened it, I saw Josh standing outside, aiming a pistol up at the window. I ducked down, fearing for my life, only to hear the two boys laughing hysterically. One of them called me a derogatory name before they walked away. There were a couple more incidents that week where they harassed either me or my brother. By the time moving day arrived, I couldn't have been more relieved to get out of there. Even after all these years, neither my brother nor I have told anyone about the threats or the guns. Those boys were troubled, and I'm just thankful we got out when we did. At the time I'm writing this, What I'm about to tell you happened just 2 weeks ago. I've never been particularly fond of my neighbors, but the ones I'm dealing with now are something else entirely. I'm fresh out of college and living on my own for the first time, which unfortunately means I'm in a pretty rough neighborhood, the only place I can afford a house. On one side of me, there's a family that blasts their music at all hours, and on the other side, there are two people who are, without a doubt, the creepiest neighbors I've ever had. The house next door is home to two women. One is in her 60s, and the other appears to be slightly younger, but has some severe mental disabilities. I've never figured out the exact relationship between them, whether they're mother and daughter, sisters, or something else entirely. The older woman isn't friendly at all and seems a bit disconnected from reality. The younger woman, however, is the source of most of my unease. On more than one occasion, I've been sitting on my front porch when I've witnessed the older woman holding the younger one back as she has some kind of meltdown. The younger woman would cross her arms tightly, rocking back and forth while screaming and making strange noises. Sometimes she would even point at me and mumble something to the older woman, which only added to my discomfort. It was disturbing enough that I would often go inside when it happened, unable to handle the weirdness any longer. One night, after a particularly stressful day at work, I was trying to get to bed early. Unfortunately, the neighbors were making an unusual amount of noise. The younger woman was throwing one of her fits, screaming and thrashing around, while the older woman yelled at her in distress. This went on for over an hour, and I finally couldn't take it anymore. I marched over to their house and banged on the door. The older woman answered, glaring at me with a look that said, "What the hell do you want?" I tried to be as polite as possible, asking if they could keep the noise down. She raised her eyebrows and tilted her head down, clearly annoyed by my request. Just then, the younger woman stormed into the room, screaming, "How dare you," repeatedly. The older woman had to physically restrain her from coming at me, and then she slammed the door in my face. I stood there for a moment, completely bewildered by what had just happened, before turning and heading back to my house. At least the noise had stopped, and I was finally able to get some sleep. But the peace didn't last long. I woke up in the middle of the night, feeling like no time had passed. A quick glance at the clock told me it was only 3 o'clock in the morning. I sighed in relief, thinking I could still get a few more hours of sleep. But then I thought I heard something coming from downstairs. I got out of bed and went to my door, listening intently. When I didn't hear anything else, I shrugged it off and went back to bed. Just 20 minutes later, I was jolted awake again. This time, I didn't know what had woken me up, but there was a sense of dread hanging in the air. I lay there in the dark, straining to hear something, anything, that could explain the unease. And then I heard it, a faint, whispery noise, like someone muttering under their breath. Panic set in as I fumbled for my phone on the bedside table. I didn't dare turn on the light. Instead, I used the faint glow of my phone screen to scan the room, my heart pounding in my chest. I looked at every corner, every shadow, but there was nothing there. Then I heard it again, and this time it was clear where it was coming from. I turned my head slowly toward the edge of my bed, and that's when I saw it. There, just inches away from me, was the shadowy outline of a face peering up at me from the side of the bed. The light from my phone finally revealed it, the face of the younger woman from next door. She let out a blood-curdling scream, one that sent chills down my spine. I screamed too, leaping out of bed in a panic. I tripped over myself as I tried to get to the door, glancing back to see her crawling toward me, her eyes wild and filled with madness. I barely made it out of the room, slamming the door behind me and running down the stairs. I locked the door that led upstairs and called the police, my hands shaking so badly that I could hardly dial. As I waited for them to arrive, the woman pounded on the door, screaming incoherent things that made my skin crawl. When the cops finally showed up, I explained the situation, telling them that she lived next door and was mentally unstable. The older woman came over, pleading with the officers to let her go, but they insisted on taking her in for at least the night. One of the officers asked if I wanted to press charges, but as he did, the older woman gave me the most hateful glare I had ever seen. I chose not to press charges, but her glare didn't waver. The officers drove the younger woman away, while the older woman continued to stare daggers at me as she walked back to her house. 5 minutes later, I saw her get into her car and drive off. Those two still live next door, and I'm seriously considering moving out. The older woman makes it clear that she despises me, and I've come to realize that the younger woman is not just terrifying, but dangerous as well. Love creepy stories? Subscribe now and turn on notifications so you never miss a new one. Our email is in the description. Please send in your horror stories.